One of the cool things that they've been doing really since Season 4 with the new Lorebook UI is most season episodes do now add some substantive world building and lore background through optional documents you can find around the world. In today's video, I want to look at the newest ones from Whisper in the Ice, which honestly are really difficult to find. They're very substantive. They're some of the meatiest ones the devs have ever done, and that I very much appreciate. It actually feels like we get a good amount of text. Some of the previous books didn't have too much, but you're going to have a job getting to them. This first one, for example, on this random cliff way up in the northwestern corner of the map, and you have to basically look for a tiny little rectangle on the ground to identify it. Yeah. Worse, you can't hold a button to highlight objects and see them through walls or whatever. You will only know that it's there by getting the read prompt written in orange or yellow when you're really, really close to it. Wow, I can't believe people actually found these as fast as they did. There's 4 on the map, and well, this is number 1. Probably one of the most obscure, just because it's in such a weird place. But great lore, and that's really what I want to focus on in the video, so let's check it out. First of all, Coda's Promise. Coda's Gift. They do kind of sequel into each other, by the way, and I figured this one's kind of the best one to start with. By Luca Thomas Dotter, a Vigil scribe. So this is a new character we didn't really know as far as I'm aware from previous patches. Clearly a Norn, Thomas Dotter there, clearly female. And well, a Vigil scribe is already kind of an interesting idea. You think of Dermot Priory scribes more than anything else. But do consider it's the Vigil that have been in this area of the world over the 2 recent patches. So it's Vigil efforts that would be trying to discover stuff. Though, as we learn more about this character, you'll realize that they've had some history here for a long time. And a lot of this is Codon lore, which we got a good amount of last patch too. She writes, the Codon of Still Waters speaking are, in many ways, a classic example of an isolated community. Still Waters speaking being the name of the community. So isolated, in fact, that I've not actually been able to successfully visit them in person. Instead, I must rely on the notes I took during a series of fascinating conversations with a Codon who called the settlement home. So yeah, basically she found a Codon who wasn't at the place, and he told her most of the information. Stillwater Speaking is the community you meet in the main story of this patch, so we are kind of familiar with it as the commander. We don't really get to grips with the people in the way that she will. She says that Codon, Aiding Thunder being his name, relayed to me an interesting fact that I had not noticed until he brought it up to me, that many of the Codon names in Stillwater Speaking are dissimilar to other Codon names. Though, at first blush, they appear similar, there are some tangible differences to consider that harken back to the oldest Codon conventions. Now, I must admit, guys, I'm very enthusiastic about the lore behind the Codon naming and their peoples. I think they're one of the most fascinating, so to speak, lesser races. The mod I made for the grand strategy game Stellaris, actually, I started with a Codon empire and transcribing all the different Codon names in Guild Wars 2 to that other game. So I'm really familiar with this stuff, and I didn't even notice as I played the patch, as this scribe has. So they are different, and why is that is kind of what she's wondering. For the Codon societies we are familiar with, their names are pliable. They change depending on circumstance and mood. They describe singular things. There is no first or last name. There may be 3 words to a name, maybe more, and maybe fewer. While sitting beside a fire in Safe Watch Vale, waiting for a storm to pass, Aiding Thunder confided in me his fears that the Codon had forgotten of the time when their names meant more than a passing mood. He lamented that the current naming conventions were popular with only a handful of sanctuaries that would eventually become established in the Shiver Peaks, and offered an impression of the Codon that the races of the South would go on to extrapolate to all of Codon society. But Aiding Thunder insisted that his people, including many of the tribes that perished in the far north during Jormag's rise, relied on a different naming system entirely. First of all, I just want to pause here. What this book is basically expressing, and these notes is expressing, is how thin and narrow the Codon we know have become. And that now we have an idea of what they are just because of a couple of sanctuaries, but they were much bigger, much more glorious. They had so much heritage and culture and knowledge, and so much of it has been lost in this fight against the Elder Dragons. The game sometimes talks about these kinds of themes, like with the Jotun falling out of their civilization entirely, the idea of the Sylvari being interested in the fact that knowledge can die, and well, yeah, it kind of suggests that a lot of the Codon we've seen is a bit warped. I wonder if that applies to a lot of their other philosophies as well. Not just necessarily the idea of having a claw and a voice leading them, but some of their ideas of bringing balance to the world. Is that overly represented among the Codon we know, or underrepresented? Well, the naming schemes at least are different, so why not some of this other stuff? Maybe the devs will look at that more later in the saga. Anyway, back to the writings. In Still Waters Speaking, a Codon's first name is usually based on a characteristic, not necessarily one exhibited by the cub at the moment of naming, but one wished by their family or their tribe. Humble, stoic, aiding, noble. They refer to this name as Coda's promise. So I love that idea that your first name is stuck with you. It's not this transient thing, and it's kind of what your parents want you to be. The second name is one of nature, referred to as Coda's gift, mountain, thunder, cloud, cove. The two names are combined into one, the promise always preceding the gift. I love this kind of stuff, guys, really. I remember being fascinated back when I was first introduced to Guild Wars and Tyria at the fact that different races did have different naming conventions. It just felt so fleshed out and real and like so great to latch onto. Like all the Serpentine races having lots of S's in their name just because, you know, they would sound like they're hissing and slithering all the time. And it feels so good to get back to stuff like this with the newest of content. This second name is not, I should clarify, a surname or a family name. Quite the contrary, the Codon of Still Waters Speaking seem disinterested in maintaining those family ties through name. Their settlement is so small that names are wholly unique, and family names are unnecessary. However, Aiding Thunder initially introduced himself not simply as Aiding Thunder, but instead, Aiding Thunder of Still Waters Speaking. And what of their leaders? They do not appear to use the same naming convention once they assume their position as claw or voice. Quite the contrary, each position appears to have its own convention. Aiding Thunder spoke of a claw named Cloudseeker and a voice named Ushers in Spring, which seemed to defy the standard rules. When I inquired about this, Aiding Thunder promised to explain when we met again, but sadly, that time would never come to pass. So that's the first message. The devs kind of tease us that there's even more information out there. I think it's really well written for the purpose of it, like a document that's supposed to make you believe there's like a big body of information behind everything you see in the game. It's really good because it gives you really good detail and like logical, interesting detail on a specific story. It expounds on it just enough to make you realize, oh, there's so much more to know, and then snatches it away from you. But yeah, so that's an idea of the Codon and their names. This idea that this character's met a Codon and now they've parted ways kind of continues in these sequel stories. So this one here is kind of central to the map at the bottom of the waterfall, a bit easier. Same character, Luca Thomas-Dottir. May our voices never be broken. May our voices be our own, is a quote. I first heard these words uttered by a travelling Codon outside Rime Moraine, deep in the heart of Frostgorge. That's actually the name of a waypoint, I believe. You can go there, guys. He was a stranger to that place, clearly uncomfortable with the ways of the Codon that called the place home. Aiding Thunder was his name, and he hailed from a place that I'd only heard of in story and legend. Drakkar Lake. Okay, maybe this is the first one in the series, actually. Well, that's not entirely accurate. He didn't introduce himself as Aiding Thunder. His exact words were Aiding Thunder of Still Waters Speaking. Still Waters Speaking. I'd never heard of such a sanctuary. I told him. He clarified that it was not the name of a sanctuary, though his people had indeed come from one far in the north. A sanctuary with no name he remembered, no records written, and an oral history lost to time. This is kind of beautiful. Most Codon we've seen in the game so far are tied to a sanctuary. We of course just see a wrecked, destroyed one in the mountains on this map. And the suggestion being that it was a long time ago these guys came and now they're really living in regular settlements. I really enjoy that idea because Codon obviously would be doing that as time goes forward. The Codon seemed wistful, a flicker of light in his eyes that quickly gave way to a deep sense of foreboding. Loss is a troublesome concept among Codon society. There are a great many things that once were, but no longer. A great many things that once put the Codon above all, but, well, not anymore. So this idea that they are just in the preservation of diversity and they don't want to lose things, they don't want things to become extinct or whatever, kind of feeds their ideas about balance, right? Which, by the way, this patch really doesn't talk about much. Maybe the devs don't want to emphasize those more antagonistic ideas. I inquired further, but Aiding Thunder seemed nervous about my interest. He was particularly averse to my questioning about where exactly his home was. as if simply revealing its exact location on a map might immediately turn it into a premier tourist destination. I assured him my interests were purely academic, and several hours of gentle coaxing seemed to ease the Codon's troubled mind. I love this. I have such a strong image of these two chatting. We of course know from the patch that Drakkar whispers to people, and it's this malevolent force on the lake, and it could turn people. And that's probably why the Codon doesn't want people around, really, because other people could be there, fall to whatever the lake is doing to manipulate people, and then pose a threat to the settlement. It's not just he doesn't like outsiders, it's probably much more the fact that it's Drakkar Lake. The settlement that would one day become Stillwater speaking began as a Codon sanctuary long ago, one of their many ice cities floating atop the bone-chilling waters north of the far Shiver Peaks. These ancient cities had held since the previous Elder Dragon awakening. This awakening, by the way, we really don't hear much about in lore, so it's very cool to think about this as the Codon as survivors, much as the dwarves were survivors and so on. What the Codon referred to as the Dragon Storm. They called it the Dragon Storm in reference to all the dragons, I guess? At the time, they believed the massive floating land masses to be a gift from Koda, recompense for their suffering as the rest of the world was purged by the Elder Dragons. I really want to know more about the Codon surviving within their sanctuaries. How the hell do you resist an Elder Dragon? If you've got magic on the sanctuary, what the hell do you do? Those cities stood for thousands of years, impervious to the elements. But sadly, not from Jormag. The rising seas and terrifying creatures destroyed the sanctuaries, driving the Codon south. A group of Codon from one of these sanctuaries gathered on a ship built from timber, a rarity that far north, and turned their gaze southward. They would follow the maps of their greatest explorers and seek shelter in the mountains. So by the way, the story we're hearing here is very similar, of course, to that origin myth of the Norn. The idea being during the Dragon Storm, we've already heard a story before of how some Codon left and just went south, and the legend goes that they never came back. And the idea being that they maybe devolved or something in the eyes of the Codon, devolved, and became the Norn eventually. And now here we hear, much more recently, regular Codon are doing the same with their lumber. But the maps had not accounted for Jormag's awakening. Rivers turned to lakes, mountains to valleys, and the Codon found themselves shipwrecked deep in the far Shiver Peaks, their ship locked in the ice and snow. They had stumbled into Drakkar Lake, and the lake was whispering. So that's very ominous. I really like it. Do you know what I think's also ominous about that little bit of the story? They talk about the rising sea levels and so on. I swear that they're hinting at deep sea dragon stuff. I'm so convinced they'll do something with a deep sea dragon this saga, particularly considering the opening trailer where we saw so many watery things. If Jormag awakens and freezes a ton of stuff, where's the rising sea levels coming from? I feel like the other dragon has been oppressing them too or something. Could be quite interesting. I mean, I'm really digging deep, obviously, here on this hint. So the next little paper and the continuation of the story, which is currently just the idea of, you know, a scholar of the Vigil has come and decided to camp with a Codon and learn a little bit about the sanctuary before arriving here. The next one is down in this lost Norn area where we actually find the shrine to Wolf and all that kind of stuff happens in the story underneath the ice. It's a place that I undoubtedly believe most of you will have been, and this book is probably the most likely one for people to find, but it's still a bit of a bitch, right? So you're going to come up this slope, go right over to where the Wolf shrine is, and on the rocks to the right of it behind this pillar. You see this? I mean, you really can't see this. It's almost the same color as the ground. But if you walk over there, you do get the prompt, and you get book 3 out of 5. Sorry, there's 5 books, not 4. So, hundreds of years ago, Drakkar Lake served as a battleground between the forces of good and evil. Svanir, brother of the famed Norn hero Jorah, called out to a powerful thing deep in the ice. The lake's namesake, a champion of the ice dragon, responded. Svanir was turned into a hideous mockery of his spiritual bear form, and Jorah was forced to slay him. So this is a recap of story you can experience in Guild Wars 1, Eye of the North. The expansion isn't too difficult to get to. I really recommend people play it. And obviously we're looking at the Norn side of the story now. The lake was not as active back during those days, but it did do this to Svanir, and that's where the Sons of Svanir really come from. Since then, the lake has been known as a place of curious whispers and of dark power, I guess immediately following Eye of the North. Following the rise of Jormag, Many Norn, and this is between the two games now, abandoned the ancient shrines and settlements dotting the valley, leaving them to the elements and the dragon's loyal servants. So here we are hearing about what happened in this area of the world in the gap between the two games, which is information I might not have expected us to get, but yeah. All those places and settlements you saw back then, they all just got abandoned, mostly because of the lake. It's a cool little thing for the devs to add, I think. When the Kodan arrived, shortly after Jormag's rise, they were forced to make that valley their own. The waters would take them no further, and their ships were trapped within mountains of ice. The small huts they had built to protect themselves from the cold soon became a permanent settlement. When the time came to name their new home, all of the Kodan seemed to acknowledge that there was something curious about the nearby lake. The snow muffles the sounds of nature, gives the wind a voice of its own. Yet this was different. The water itself seemed to speak, a whisper, barely perceptible. The Kodan named their settlement after this strange phenomenon, Still Waters Speaking. Then Zaitan was slain, then Morgemoth, then Kralkatorrik. With each elder dragon slain by the Pact Commander and their allies, the whispers seemed to grow louder. What was once a murmur on the wind soon became fully formed words. You heard the words, and the words knew you heard them. They would speak to you, tell you what you wanted to hear. You would begin to trust the words as your own thoughts. Man, this is really creepy, totally in line with the patch. Do you know what I particularly find really fascinating and fun? That Drakkar, which is this thing frozen under ice and seems to be fairly inactive, is somehow reacting to the death of these other elder dragons on other sides of the continent. Like, there's this vast gap between them, and yet this malevolent, silent, still thing is like growing and getting restless from something. You can even conceive how it knows or it's reacting to this, but that just speaks to its power, you know? There's something so lovely and creepy about something that doesn't move much but seems smart to me. Anyway, and that was how Jormag's thoughts became your thoughts. Somehow, Drakkar's presence in the lake was making Jormag's voice louder in the valley. The Kodan knew what was happening before anyone else. They figured out what Drakkar was. Drakkar, the creature in the lake, the ice dragon's personal champion, was a mouthpiece for the elder dragon, an amplifier of sorts, capable of spreading the whispers of the elder dragon far beyond its lair. And with the death of Kralkatorrik and the emergence of a new elder dragon in his stead, Drakkar's whispers became unbearable. No, so this is pretty interesting. We are currently in a story where we don't know whether Jormag really likes Aurene or not. It's saying that it likes the idea of a new cycle and it's trying to convince us. But does it see Aurene as a threat? You could understand why it might. And so now we get this passage. This actually goes right to the heart of some of the big story at the moment. Does Jormag actually believe in what Aurene is trying to do? Well, we do know that as soon as Aurene came on the table, this thing started whispering a lot. It's definitely got an opinion. We just don't know what it is. The Kodan of Still Waters Speaking, who had once traded and communicated with all manner of settlements and factions beyond their borders, closed themselves off to the outside world. I suppose those would be southern borders mostly, right? There's not much north of here, is there? They could not know which thoughts were their own and which were the dragon's. Whose voice was whose? Was your voice yours? Or was it Jormag's? Aiding Thunder was a Kodan of Still Waters Speaking, and I had the pleasure of making his acquaintance in Frostgorge Sound shortly following the demise of Zaitan. This is weird. All three basically overlap on their information. Like, she's written these pages for different purposes and different people. He'd gone to other Kodan sanctuaries seeking supplies and knowledge of the outside world, perhaps knowing deep down that the whispers would only continue to grow louder as the current Elder Dragon cycle persisted. When I travelled to Still Waters Speaking shortly thereafter, following the demise of Morgemoth, the Kodan guards standing before the closed settlement gate snarled at me, demanding I leave. The valley, they said, was far too dangerous for one unaccustomed to the whispers. I asked whatever happened to Aiding Thunder, the Kodan I had met not long ago. The guards looked at each other. Was it anger? Shame? One of them turned to me, taking a troubled breath, stifling tears. His voice was not his own, he said. I asked if Aiding Thunder was alright. I asked if I could see him. If you listen, you will hear him. He will call you across the lake. He will call you to the west. The Kodan guard stared at me, unblinking. You must not listen. It is not his voice you are hearing. So I think where this book is actually located is right after we discover that when Bram was called across the lake, he was actually okay in the end, and it was the spirit of the wild that was talking to him. I mean, presumably, unless this is some massive double bluff that's going to go across multiple patches. So then we get this book, and we hear about this Codon that was dragged across the lake, and the question is, were they being manipulated? I think the idea really is, yes, they are. But what we get to do now with these little lore books is pretty cool. We get to find out where they ended up after Jormag and Drakkar really got into their head, and you get a really good insight into that, which you don't anywhere else in the patch, really. The place that you find the book is deep inside one of the light puzzle rooms that you need to trigger a Raven gate to get to. So I like the idea that the Norn knew how to commune with Raven to a certain extent or something to actually get through the gate. We probably don't need to think about it too much. But already we're in an obscure area of the patch, and it's in the corner you can find the body of the Norn. There's no other hint as to how they died or what they did, but they do have a book next to them. So this is the last thing written by Luca. Be quiet. Please. Stop. You don't listen to me anymore. It's like I'm talking to a wall. Words won't do. I've screamed at you for so long that I have no voice. There are no more words. I will never speak again. So I write, hoping you will read these words and leave me alone. Day after day you speak to me. At first I thought you were aiding Thunder. Even when the Kodan outside the village said he was gone. Actually, no. They only said his voice wasn't his own. I thought maybe he was still out there. I thought the warriors of Stillwater Speaking had rashly exiled one of their own in an act of paranoid delusion. Surely, the same Codon that I met in Frostgorge Sound, the Codon I shared stories with by the fire in Safewatch Vale, could not have turned to madness so easily. So I followed the voice. His voice. I followed it west, across the lake where the Svarnir was turned. The voice asked me if I wanted to see Aiding Thunder again, asked me if I wanted to learn the secrets of the Codon. I said yes. Raven's eyes, I said yes. I didn't even stop to ask why Aiding Thunder's voice would ask such things of me. I didn't stop to think. Aiding Thunder emerged from the passage leading down into the frozen lake. He told me to follow him, and when we journeyed through the valley unhindered, the creatures that had nipped at my heels not hours before were now granting safe passage. I thought that was strange, to be sure, but I paid it no mind. Perhaps they had just feasted on some other unfortunate creature, and I was spared simply by a lack of appetite. What I think is really important to note here is that the vision that this character saw, emulated a full-on Codon, even though there was no Codon there, right? So when Bram saw the wolf spirit telling him he's special and all this stuff, which is totally contrary to what Asgeir said, by the way, in the original patch. Was that also just a machination of Jormag? Was the shrine there the representation of the spirit of the wild? Was it all just complete BS? This story seems to suggest that's possible. It can manifest full-on hallucinations. The Codon took me to these ruins and told me everything I'd ever wanted to know. Not just about the Codon, but about every race interior. The mists, all that was past, all that is present. I had asked for knowledge, and I received it. I received so much that I was forced to stop writing as my hands bled. But the voice continued to speak. I looked up and Aiding Thunder was gone. The voice remained. The voice began to change. It was no longer Aiding Thunder's. It was yours. Jormag, I beg of you, stop whispering to me. I can listen no longer. So, there is the idea that I very much like that Jormag's kind of maybe decent, maybe. I mean, they need to ride that line, right, a little bit as the story goes along, but this seems ludicrously malevolent in this story, to a really, really, really cool way. And that's the last we hear of this character, who's now dead with this book. But you really get an insight into what it's like to go crazy. I think the devs did a lot of stuff this patch to try and influence that. And this is really the one that paid off more than anything else. Really getting into the mind of someone that kind of lost it. And was the knowledge that she got real? I mean, she certainly got answers from Jormag. And I'm sure that Jormag can answer a lot of stuff. Jormag kept its word, but at what price? So that's the main story. I will note that there is another little bit of lore in the patch too. It's very easy to get to. It's back at the first outpost. It was an example of one of those additions to the map that was added to the first half we got before. And it's, in some ways, one of my favorite pieces. It's not to do with the Codon or Jormag necessarily, or this specific character, but the Vigil, and with Almora passing away last episode in kind of a rubbish way, you might be wondering, why is Jarvi the one that stepped up? Because who's the other big character in the Vigil? It's Loranthir. It's always been Loranthir. Even back in the personal story, there was a lot of stuff with Loranthir, and Loranthir is a fan favorite character of mine. Well, the devs thought of this, and check this out. Specifically to address this question of Loranthir, there is another note, and it's from Almora herself. Following our victories on Dragonfall, Grand Warmaster Loranthir has submitted a request for a temporary leave of absence so he may return to the Grove. It's my personal recommendation that he be granted this request, and he be allowed to return to Vigil duties at his discretion. Loranthir has proven a strong and capable leader of our order, his instincts unimpeachable, and my trust in him unshakable. He will be missed by the Vigil, but we expect Loranthir will return to his post in due time. Until that happens, I will work with Jarvi to ensure she is prepared for her new responsibilities as my second in command. Soulkeeper. So there's like 3 things to think about here. First, I kind of appreciate it in that we just get a little bit more from Almora, even if it's posthumous. And I really hope that they might do something more, find out that she didn't die, it was a vision or something, I'm not sure. I feel like it's kind of tacky to have a character, she was all about Kraukatork and stuff, Kraukatork's done, and then she's instantly killed off, you know. I kind of felt like to make it feel natural, they could have gone a bit further. You've got this sword as well here, by the way, which I never looked at last patch, but is a part of this. It's not new, it was from the previous release. You got that to think about. Then there's also the question, did they just write that so that people would have a bit of an answer about Loranthir? I mean, that's very cool. Or did they do it because they really specifically got Loranthir out of the picture because they want to do something fun? Maybe they're thinking about the Grove again to a certain extent, and the Pale Tree, who's kind of needs a little bit of a tie-up on the story, maybe. Perhaps we will consult with the Pale Tree when we learn a bit more about Jormag and its manipulative capacity, because the Pale Tree might have some insight owing to its, you know, Mordramoth connection or something. Or it's just, you know, they're having problems with the voice actor and they're not in the patch anymore, so they write this little message here and explain why they're not around. Loranthir is definitely a cool character, and it really made me happy to see that the devs gave him a specific little message about where he is, because it kind of shows that their priorities in terms of what characters are cool kind of align with mine, and that feels kind of nice. So there you go, that's the extra lore from this patch in terms of all the written stuff. I hope you guys enjoyed. I no doubt will have missed some really cool subtle things, or misinterpreted some stuff, or talked about something you may have taken in a different way. So please, leave some comments. This is the kind of video where the comments will be really good. You'll definitely get some insights from everyone else, and feel free to drop your own. I'll be watching very closely, drop some hearts on some that I think are really good. And until next time, guys, I will see you very shortly. If you've been a bit out of the loop, I did a full audiobook this week. I've done a channel update talking about all my ambitions for the upcoming year, and I've started covering the Elder Scrolls. So please, if you want to, take a look at some of the other stuff that's going on my channel. It would really mean the world to me. Thank you, guys. See you next time.